My name is Gina Seervogel. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town. And we're going to have a discussion today about flooding. And I think it's a really important topic, and some people here will have felt that for a long time and have been involved in flooding related issues or be very aware of them or concerned about them. Others might have had less engagement in the topic, but I know that we all have been made acutely aware of the extent of flooding as a hazard from seeing what happened in eThekwini and KZN recently. And then, of course, last week we had significant flooding here in Cape Town. So I think this is a really important topic to grapple with. And I was part of a project that we had over 10 years ago now, looking at flooding in Cape Town. So it's a topic that I've been interested in for a while. And I come to it from a climate change interest point of view, but it really does impact on many aspects of urban life, particularly in winter for us here in Cape Town. And I think what I saw when we were doing that work is how it is quite pervasive in Cape Town because of the nature of flooding. So in the low-lying areas, we have rising flooding because of high water tables, which is quite different to some other areas and cities which have riverine flooding where the rivers flood their banks. So the nature of flooding is important to understand. And the Cape Flats obviously is a low-lying area with a high water table. And what we really saw through our project was just how complex it was to address flooding risk. It is not a simple thing to address. There's so many different elements. We worked with different departments in the city, all doing different things. Amy will talk to us a bit about the city's response and the winter readiness program, but it's a complex problem that needs different actors to come together, both within the city and beyond the city. And we know that these governance challenges are really important to address, but often quite hard. So it's great to have you all here. Just to say that this is part of the Futurecasting Cape Town session, and that's convened by the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership, EDP, and the City of Cape Town's Resilience Department. And so this is trying to create a platform for conversations across different sectors to think about how we can build the future resilience of our city. For those who don't know, EDP is a public benefit intermediary organization that helps stakeholders from different sectors to work together collaboratively to achieve inclusive and sustainable development outcomes and improve well-being in our society. They specialize in systems mapping, designing collaborative partnering processes, and fostering adaptive management skills across sectors. And that bit about collaborative partnering is something that they've been passionate about for a long time, and I think is very central to this flooding question. So I'm just going to hand over now to Gareth Morgan, the Acting Executive Director of Future Planning and Resilience. Thanks, Gareth.
Hello, everyone. Gina, thank you very much for hosting this event today. It's a great pleasure to be able to make some opening remarks on behalf of the Future Planning and Resilience Directorate in the City of Cape Town. I'd like to also thank the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership for continuing to curate these events. This is the 5th event in the last 12 months. Futurecasting is an action of the Cape Town Resilience Strategy approved in August 2019. And over the last 12 months, we've dealt with a range of topics in the Futurecasting events, including the impacts of climate change on mental health. We've looked at heat waves, today flooding. We've looked at the changing nature of risk, and we've also looked at global impacts or global shock events and their impacts on Cape Town. At all times, trying to bring together a wide range of stakeholders from business, civil society, government, academia, in order to look at a range of shock events, some that have materialized and some that may plausibly materialize, to work out a range of responses, but also to collaborate and potentially co-own certain components of dealing with the complex problem. So thank you to everyone for being in attendance today. And I'd also like to thank our speakers who've given up their time to share their expert knowledge from a wide range of different perspectives. Flooding, as Gina said, is a very relevant topic in light of the recent events in eThekwini and in light of the extreme weather events in Cape Town last week. This is indeed an important shock event that the city of Cape Town needs to do much more in order to build resilience over the medium to long term. But of course, there are also a range of short-term interventions that need to be made on an ongoing basis. And my colleague, Amy Davison, will no doubt make a few comments in this regard. I'd like to wish everyone a great Futurecasting event today. Please, I hope that we can bring also a range of new solutions to the problems that we confront. And I hope that you also enjoy this event. Thank you very much, Gina. Back to you.
Great, thanks, Gareth. Yeah, and just to pick up on that idea of future casting and how do we look ahead to think what might be needed to make a more resilient city. And sometimes the things that we're trying to do in the current frameworks, and sometimes we have to have new ideas. So we're going to put some things on the table. We also hope for engagement from you as the audience. We're going to do that through the chat box, but please, we'd love you to share both questions and experiences that you've had in the chat box as well. So we'd like to use that opportunity. And we're also going to use the chat box for introductions with a bit more background on everybody. But I'm just going to let you know who's speaking today. So David Ali from Informal Settlements in Western Cape will go first, followed by Lebogang Magati from South African Weather Service. Then Chris Jack from the Climate Systems Analysis Group at UCT, and followed by Amy Davison from the Resilience Department, Climate Change at the City. So with that, I'd like to pass over to David and just a little update on the format before David starts. Each presenter is asked to talk for 7 to 8 minutes, so we've asked them to keep it relatively short. And then I'm going to ask all 4 of them similar questions, and then we'll move on to the question and answer. Great. Thanks, David. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and glad to be here to participate in this conversation. As I've been introduced, my name is David Harley from the Department of Human Settlement, Western Cape, responsible for the Informal Settlement Support Program. I would like to touch on preparedness in terms of preparedness of cities. But before I do that, just in case my time, I'm not able to catch up with all my slides before the time runs by. This is the thinking and this is the context. Preparedness of cities is not just an event. It's not just for today. It's a journey, and it's myopic for literatures or reviewers to think it's just an event. One size fits all approach wouldn't respond to all the challenges we have out there. It has been raised earlier, speakers, that inadequate utilization of the whole of society in the paradigm shift is a problem. And often at times, professionals are in flight mode. They run past or the lowest strata of the society in dealing with the response. So in my own thinking, I'll probably want to assume that preparedness relates to infrastructure capacity, relates to resources, relates to funding, it relates to awareness, and ultimately mitigating all the risk and partnership. So literature, I've got it all the attributes of flooding, attributes of climate change, you know, the society and all the likes. But bringing it home in terms of South African context, we've seen the slowing economy, declining revenue, loss of income, in-migration, increased number of households in informality. And ultimately, you have demand for services and increased dependency on state. All this puts together inculcates the push factor that is faced by cities in responding adequately to the problems of urbanization. So if you now start putting the maths together in terms of statistics, you look at the projection of population within our cities in South Africa at large. In 2001, 1 in 7 households reside in one informality or the other. By 2011, we have 1 in 6. And the projection and the observation we see around is that by 2021, after the census is being concluded, we might be having 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 households residing in informality. The picture at the bottom shows that if we are real with ourselves, and that is the reality. And I'll give you examples of where the pressure point will come in. Immigration into the city of Cape Town or into the cities will continue. And that would mean that we need to cost the affordability of urbanization. And if you now look at the two sector of housing components, you have the green field and you have the brown field. You have the green that is formal and you have the brown that is informal. So if somebody arrives in Cape Town and affordability is the question and the person requires a shelter, the first thing that comes to mind, where can I go? What's the cost? And if you look at the property prices in Cape Town or rental prices, affordability is key. And that is where majority of our problem lies. And the driving factor of where people end up in terms of their shelter, their proximity to services or employment opportunity, they go to the open spaces, the wetland, the flood line, the river embankment, stormwater channels, and all environmental sensitive areas. That's what we've seen in the past. So in my own presentation, I'll be dealing mostly with the informality of the urbanization or within the cities. So this is a typical example. I just want to pitch some example of what we experience. In 2019, towards the COVID, this is the image on your far left is the reality in 2018. By the time it gets to 2021, you can see the informality growing towards the wetland, and there's a river here. So that's the reality. We might think it's not our problem, but I'll show you a better idea of how it becomes your problem. So if you look at drift sand as well, this is a wetland, nature reserve, where you have your stormwater channel towards this area, and it's part of City of Cape Town Otuation pond, where you have stormwater being channeled. You have a dam there, close to 12,000 structures, which means about 12,000 households have recently invaded within the space of 2 years during the lockdown and up till now, and it's still growing and it's increasing daily. So natural resultant of our activities in cities or in the environment at large, you have fire, you have flooding, you have waste management problem. So this is just to tell you that these are the realities of people in migration or growth of cities generally, that people in search for accommodation or shelter, they go to the low-lying areas, floodplains. And we might think that this is not our problem. And we might also think that this is not, we shouldn't be concerned about this, but this is the reality. That you will sit in your house, in your 2 million, 5 million houses and think things are okay. People are filling low-lying areas, and which means the water level will continue to rise in other areas because all the ponds or the stormwater channels have been sand-filled, and waste is another problem. This is an example of what is currently happening in drift sand. So we have all this element of protest, we have all this element of demand for services, demand for housing. But as just a snapshot of the problem that we're dealing with, that we've neglected a sector, the lower strata of the economy or of the population, to their own peril, in their own precarious situation. In city of Cape Town alone, we have 527 informal settlements, and majority of them are in low-lying areas, are in open spaces that are meant for mitigating and resilience of cities. So as a department, we sit in the provincial sphere of government. We've been able to categorize majority of the informal settlement to determine and to assess where they are. If you look at the tree of decision on the right-hand side, we have close to 25% of our informal settlement categorized as C, which means they needed to be relocated because there's bound to be disaster in terms of flooding, in terms of slope, in terms of road reserves, and all those elements. But if you look deep into the statistics and data that we have, you find that low-lying area flood lines is where we have the majority of this informal settlement. And where do we take them? We need money, we need the land. And urban land is so much contested in terms of uses that it's difficult for government alone to be able to prioritize the intervention to informal settlement. So this is an example of what government is doing. We want to upgrade all those informal settlement in low-lying areas. We want to be able to relocate where feasible, but the land is the issue and the contested area. So as part of a government program, after your broader count of informal settlement, we do enumeration and survey to know the number, to know the status, to know the profile of people residing in informal settlement. As a department, I'm not speaking for the whole of government here, all of provincial government. I'm speaking in terms of what Department of Human Settlement is responsible and doing. We do the enumeration to be able to ascertain numbers and to be able to communicate to the people in the area. So what we do is to say, okay, how many? If it's 12,000, the last count we did in Driftsand, for instance, was about 4,500, and it has increased to 12,000. We are not able to meet up with the rate of growth in terms of survey, in terms of count. So in my closing remark, it's that we need to engage the lower strata in terms of preparedness for flood, because they are the most at risk. Mobilizing is not an easy task. To mobilize an informal community is not an easy task, but we need to do it. That is what it calls for at this stage. Co-designing with them. I think all of us, we know that importing foreign ideas into our local sphere and into our bottom strata of the economy or population, it's always very difficult. And implementation becomes easy if we co-design with them, and ultimately maintenance is each free. So the cycle continues depending on the intervention that we want to implement in the area. My closing remark is that we need to accept that preparedness is everyone's business. Informal settlement are part of the urban fabric, and they should be incorporated into the preparedness program. People matter. We need to involve them in decision-making and the intervention we design. Devolve decision through negotiated and dialogue. I think that's critical for us. Shift the attention of government, of state, from provider to enabler and broker. And pursue preparedness solution through public-private partnership. I think it's been raised that it's everyone's business, but partnership with everybody, it's the key. Allow incremental improvement and proactively planning and targeting. I think that's the end of my presentation. In terms of reference, you might have access to some of our materials as human settlement department, not disaster management department. Thank you, and be prepared to take questions.
Thank you very much, David. That was really, really insightful. I think we can stop the slide share now. That's great. And I just wanted to pick up on a few things you said, because for me, you really illustrated very clearly to us how the different parts of the system are all connected. We can't just address one and have that sort of myopic view, as you said. One of the issues that I saw very clearly in the work I did, and you just picked up so clearly, is how important land and housing is, that it's a really tricky situation, but much of that is because of poverty and inequality in our country and in our city, and that we actually have to face that head on. And the informal settlements are essential parts of where we're seeing that challenge. And so embracing that, engaging people, you mentioned that word co-design, which is so important, but of course also so challenging. We know that there are a lot of tensions between government and citizens. And so where are some of the opportunities where collaboration and co-design has worked? So maybe later in the discussion, in the chat, people can share some of those kinds of examples. And then I really like the fact that you brought up your enumeration and data, because we really have to understand the problem. Sometimes we assume what's happening, but if we collect data, we can better understand it. And if there are these opportunities for collaboration and participation, we can have a better understanding of the local context and therefore understand what works. And from the work I do in climate change adaptation, this is absolutely central. And we're seeing a big push towards this now, but a lot of challenges in actually implementing that on the ground. So thanks, David. And we're not going to have specific questions for David now, but please feel free to put those in the chat or note them down so that in the discussion we can come back to David and that very rich presentation. But now we're going to go over to Lebogang.
Good morning to the team. Are you going to share the presentation on my behalf?
Have you asked Kate to do that, or Marcella, have they got it?
I'm not okay, I probably need to share on my side.
Okay, thanks.
Can you just confirm if you can see my screen?
Perfect, yes, great, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning to the participants and to the organizers. Firstly, let me take the opportunity to thank you for the opportunity to give this talk today. My name is Lebogang Makgadi. I'm the regional manager at the South African Weather Service. I'll be taking you through the presentation today. The outline of the presentation, firstly, I'll touch on who we are as the South African Weather Service, not assuming that everybody knows us, what we do, then a brief highlight on the recent KwaZulu Natal disasters and some facts about Cape Town. And I guess the main question is the likelihood of the KZN floods happening in Cape Town and what sort of challenges that we currently faced with. In terms of who we are mandated as the South African Weather Service by the South African Weather Service Act of 2001 as amended in 2013. We are the single authoritative voice for severe weather warnings in South Africa. So what this means is that we are the only institution that can issue severe weather warnings in South Africa. So no one is allowed to issue any warnings on severe weather events apart from the South African Weather Service. And we are also a member of the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. So through this international membership, we need to comply with the requirements and guidelines of WMO in executing our work. What we do hazard monitoring, but what are hazards? Hazards are things like your drought, meteorological drought, fires, floods, heavy rain, severe thunderstorms, strong winds, and so many of them. So those are what we call hazards. Heat waves, extreme cold temperatures, snow, those are hazards. Our responsibility is to monitor hazards. And when we realize that they could be severe or result in some impact in communities, we then have to issue warnings or what we call early warnings. So we then also responsible for forecasting. So we need to forecast these hazards We must monitor them, we forecast them. And like, as I already indicated, we have to issue warnings where necessary. And most importantly, we need to make sure that our warnings are able to reach the public and the stakeholders, more especially those people that are vulnerable or are at risk of being affected by a potential hazardous event. We need to ensure that they are able to reach our warnings. So I'm just going to share with you what has happened in 2017 with regard to our work and obviously our collaboration with other stakeholders. Because of the nature of the work that we do, we will not be able to reach out to the communities or the stakeholders without collaborating with other state departments and other institutions. So we work very closely with disaster management from the national level all the way down cascaded to the local municipality level. So that is our presence is strongly there because that's where we advise the decision makers on severe weather events and so that they can take the necessary precautions or actions to try and mitigate risk. So sometime in 2017, Cape Town experienced what we call the Cape Storm. And with that system, we're going to experience some devastations within the city from high winds, very high waves, and rainfall exceeding 50 millimeters in a 24-hour period. So in our work, we had to then advise disaster management and the relevant institutions of the hazardous conditions that were expected within the Cape Town city and surrounding areas. And they then had to take some precautionary measures to try and minimize losses. So I'm sharing with you here the media release that was then released from the Office of the Premier back then. And there was a media release issued from the Department of Education because this event was expected during school days, during weekdays. The media release was actually cautioning the public to avoid being on the road unnecessarily. And at the same time, the media release from the Department of Education was instructing all the schools to close down on the 7th of June to try and reduce losses. And indeed, that decision was based on the advice from the South African Weather Service. I'm not sure how clear you can see my screen, but the second line, it does say that the Provincial Disaster Management and the South African Weather Service briefed cabinet on the possible impact of the severe weather. So this decision was based purely on what the South African Weather Service was advising. And later that day and later that evening, we've seen some impacts that have occurred. There's been quite great economic losses following that particular event. Just sharing with you some pictures, the flooding in sea points and surrounding areas. And subsequently, there was also those Knysna fires, which lasted for days, which were caused obviously by the strong winds associated with that system. So I just want us to take a quick look of what happened with the KwaZulu Natal recent weather-related disaster. We just picked up some few stations. I'm gonna try to move this tab a little bit up. We just picked up at least 3 stations just to share with you in terms of the rainfall that was measured in a 24-hour period. You could see Durban South measured almost 200 millimeters in a 24-hour period. This was not a new record though. The highest record remains 265 millimeters, which was measured on the 12th of January, 1996. So you can see really the trend in terms of the vulnerability of KZN to flooding and heavy rain events. King Shaka Airport, with that system in April, we had new records where King Shaka Airport recorded a new high of 255.2 millimeters of rain measured in a 24-hour period, whereas the previous highest record was sitting at 128.4, and that was measured on the 25th of July, 2016. Pennington South which happens to be on the southern part of the province, there was a new record there as well of 309.2 millimeters of rain. This is a new record, and the previous record there happened to have been 191.2 measured on the 17th of June 2008. And we've just shared some pictures of the damages. Some of them you might have seen them already in the media, in the news during that time. Continue to the second slide. So what do we know about Cape Town? Just some facts about Cape Town. We've just picked up only 2 stations, the Cape Town City, which is central, and Cape Town Airport. Our highest rainfall ever recorded, 150.5 millimeters in a 24-hour period for Cape Town, and this was measured on the 1st of August, 1996. So you can see we don't come any close to KZN. KZN is highly vulnerable to flooding, which is also exacerbated by the Agala's current running through there. Then Cape Town International Airport, our highest rainfall ever measured in a 24-hour period remains 93.7 millimeters, and this was measured on the 11th of April, 1993. Go to the second slide. Okay, I guess the big question then is, what is the likelihood of KZN floods to occur in Cape Town? And we can only answer this question through projections. Our climate change projections are the ones that will be able to guide us whether there is likelihood of us experiencing that. So we ran some index to prepare for this presentation. And the index that we prepared here was the consecutive wet day index. And why the consecutive wet day index? Because most of the flooding would occur when there is accumulation of rainfall over a number of consecutive days. So you would realize even with the KZN flooding, if we're looking at consecutive days, some of the stations, they've measured over 500 millimeters of rainfall. But again, the most important thing with consecutive wet days is that mainly when the rainfall, when we experience rainfall, it gets absorbed by the soil up to a point when the soil is saturated, it cannot absorb any water anymore. Then the water starts to flood. That's when we start to experience flooding. So if we experience rainfall over a consecutive number of days, there is high possibility of experiencing flooding or flooded road, flooding in settlements due to that accumulation of rainfall. And just to make a reference to a recent example, just last week here in Cape Town, we had issued a warning of flooding, and that had occurred over consecutive number of days, which was starting from the Sunday, Monday, and the Tuesday. So through that consecutive days, accumulation of rainfall was high, and we did indeed experience some flooding in some places. So that's the reason why we chose to look at the consecutive wet day index. There's more other indices that one could look at if you want to look at projections. So secondly, I'll also touch on what the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, what is the difference? The RCP 4.5, this is when we're doing projections, assuming that there will be climate change mitigation measures in place. And RCP 8.5, it's assuming a business as usual scenario. So this 8.5 is a business as usual, no mitigation measures in place. Now, what we're seeing from the images, if you look at Cape Town there, or rather, let me start with the legend, anything above positive, on the positive side, it's indicating that there is likelihood of the number of days to increase, and anything in the negative, the likelihood for the number of days to decrease. So what we're seeing over Cape Town, especially in the top line there, we're seeing that there is likelihood of the number of consecutive days to decrease by approximately 1 day. And what that would mean, we might not be seeing an increased number of consecutive days where we get rainfall exceeding or above 1 millimeters over this region. So also one could also be, when I looked at the consecutive dry days, you could see some drying up over the Cape Town region.
Lebogang, are you able to wrap up?
Oh, okay. I'll quickly move to the second one. Yeah, with the business, thank you, Marcelo. With the business as usual scenario, almost similar conditions, one could say a projected decrease in the number of consecutive days. My last slide. I tend to struggle now when I have to move between the slides. Okay, our current challenges, quickly wrap up. Lack of observational data in the Southern Oceans, which is contributing to model uncertainty. So it becomes difficult for us to track these systems because we don't have enough observational data over the Southern Oceans. We do have a lot of data over land. And our early warning messages not reaching every resident ahead of time, especially those in remote areas. This is what we want people to be able to get our warning messages so that they can act proactively to minimize losses. The other key thing is that when impacts occur, we experience electricity cuts, cell towers are down, internet is down. We are therefore not able to send out warning messages to response teams and the public. And this is the time when people need to stay abreast of what are the latest developments in terms of weather. Weather warnings are currently issued in the medium of communication, which is English. But as you know, we in South Africa, we are a diversified country with 11 official languages. So we want to make sure that everybody is able to receive all our warning messages in the language that they can understand. I think this is the end of my slide. I want to take the opportunity to thank the contributors to the presentation. Ms. Kate Turner is here. She's a senior forecaster, Robin Lee, Mosamu Kanazi from our climate services, and our lead scientist in climate change, Dr. Adiola. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lebogang, for that really informative presentation, and really great to hear about some of those details. The importance of warnings, I think, came through very clearly, the early warnings. And I know it would be great also to speak later about what happens when you get early warnings, because early warnings on their own are very important. And as you said, we need to think about how those reach people, the language, etc. But acting on those warnings and having plans is as important. And you gave the example of the 2017 Cape storms and how that was able to be responded to and plans made to try and limit damage. But that's something we need to think about. And then really great to see some of the climate change science, some of the projections and what that means for thinking about future extreme events and intense precipitation, but also how climate differs across the country between different places. So over to Chris Jack to carry on a bit of a climate theme. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Gina. Yeah, I don't have any slides to share. I decided to keep it in more of a narrative. But I just want to say thank you to David and Lebogang for setting up the discussion really nicely. I think you've touched on a number of points that that I would like to build on today. So I'm going to, yes, as Gina says, I'm going to focus much more on the sort of climate change angle. That's my kind of area of expertise and the area I worked in the most. But obviously these things all integrate, and I think we'll bring that together towards the end. I think a lot of us will still have the imagery that Lebo just shared around the eThekwini floods as a very powerful example of the impact of flooding. And obviously the question that came up there, or a number of questions that came up with eThekwini is, why were we surprised by it? Were we surprised by it? Depending on who you talk to, there's a lot of questions around whether we anticipated that event, whether it could have been anticipated better, whether it could have been planned for better. So obviously a lot of questions come out of events like that. The other really key question that always comes out these days, of course, is, was that caused by climate change? And that's an interesting question to try and answer. So there has been an attribution study that a number of us were involved in, where we tried to look at whether climate change influenced the probability of an event like that happening. Those studies are obviously conditional on how you define the event and a number of other things, that assumptions that one needs to make. But it did draw the conclusion that it's very likely that climate change did increase the probability of an event like that happening in that location. So I think we have growing evidence that climate change is influencing these kind of events. But of course, these events have happened before. So many of you on this call, and I know many others I've spoken to, will point back to past events, and Lebo's already pointed back to some past rainfall records that show that these kind of events have happened before, back in the 60s, and definitely even before that. So it's not that climate change is creating a new thing. These events have always happened. David pointed out that cities are often changing very rapidly. So in many cases, when we're working in urban contexts, cities are sometimes changing. I mean, you can't really compare them, but changing faster than the climate system. And so with urban climate change adaptation, we're really dealing with multiple things changing at the same time, which makes it very dynamic and quite complex. And of course, we're thinking across multiple timescales. So the projections that Lebo just presented, looking quite distant future, and yet, the event last week, we were dealing with very short time scale responses. So in dealing with flooding as a risk, we have to engage across these multiple timescales, and that's a significant challenge for governance, for decision making, for financial allocations, for a lot of things. That makes that really complicated. But to talk about Cape Town, I think Cape Town's a really interesting case, because we've been through a big drought event in the last few years. So many of us are very aware of climate change through the lens of increasing droughts and decreasing water availability, and everything that city is kind of tried to ramp up to respond to that kind of threat. And yet we still have these flooding events, which is too much rainfall, too much water. And these would seem to be somewhat contradictory. And certainly the climate projections that Lebo just presented suggest that Cape Town will likely continue to get drier into the future. So should we expect less extreme flooding events like we experienced last week and we've experienced previously? So we have this kind of dichotomy of a drying location, and yet questions around potentially increasing extreme events. Are those two contradictory? And the answer is actually no. There's a lot of studies, I'm not going to dive into a lot of the details, but a lot of studies globally and Southern Hemisphere and regionally that clearly demonstrate that with climate change, you can have decreasing rainfall, but increasing extremes. And I think that's a really key thing to understand. So, for example, we all know that flooding in Cape Town is driven by a mid-latitude system. So it's basically cold fronts, sometimes it's kettle flows, but often it's a cold front that originates in the mid-latitudes. And there's really good evidence that climate change is shifting those cold fronts to the south. So we expect less rainfall. We have been getting a bit less rainfall, and we should expect those cold fronts to be further south and impact us less. But there's also evidence that the intensity of the cyclones that drive those cold fronts is increasing and may continue to increase into the future. So when cold fronts do impinge on Cape Town, we can expect that the intensity would be higher. And then there's a really strong theoretical and evidential basis for increasing rainfall within a cold front because of a warmer atmosphere and increased moisture in the atmosphere. So even though the projections that Lebo presented point towards a drier Cape Town, there is also strong evidence that we should be anticipating increased intensity of rainfall events in the future. So should we be surprised by flooding? This is a question that keeps coming around in my head, is why are we surprised by these events? Are we surprised by these events? How do we think about these kind of events? We don't know when they're going to happen. We know that they will happen. So how do we plan for it? We definitely have the evidence to work with. Even around the drought in Cape Town, there was evidence many years before the drought occurred that Cape Town could be getting less rainfall in the future. Many of the water resource planning scenarios included decreasing rainfall and what needed to be done to respond to that. So often we have the evidence to work with. That doesn't mean we don't need more evidence. And I take David's point, we need more evidence on a number of different areas, including population, informal settlements, and some of the climate evidence, definitely. But the key question to me is how that evidence being integrated into decision-making. And that's the point that David started bringing up, and I think we really need to build on in this discussion. How does that evidence come into decision-making? Who's making the decisions? How are those decisions made? And a lot of decisions are made by formal government, but many decisions are made informally by private sector, by private individuals who are making different cost-benefit trade-offs based on the evidence that they have. And I think these cost-benefit trade-offs are really important. With infinite resources, we could do amazing things to make the city of Cape Town flood resilient, but it would take resources away from other activities and other interventions. So we're always trading off the cost and benefit of different interventions. And how do those trade-offs happen? Who's involved in those conversations? These are the points that David was making really nicely. So I think for me, the way forward is really exploring how we bring evidence into decision-making and how that decision-making occurs, who's in the room, who's participating in those conversations. Away from these kind of divergent perspectives. I remember around the Cape Town drought, there were a number of divergent perspectives. People saying it's not climate change, it's bad management. Other people saying it's climate change. People saying it's causing injustice for the poor population groups. Others saying it's not. And there's all these divergent perspectives. So the real challenge to me is how we bring these divergent perspectives into the same room so they don't pull us apart and stop us having conversations and learning together. And then how we bring the evidence that we have, and really strong evidence, into that same space to inform our decision making. So I'm going to leave it there. I know we're quite short of time, but I think this question around collaborative learning, collaborative decision making, and the evidence that goes into that is really key going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And maybe just this one question that's come in, because it's very specific to this. Do prevailing drier weather conditions predispose to more severe flooding when we do get heavy rainfall because of things like changing vegetation and topography? Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. Again, there's a timescales question here, but I know in the eThekwini case, there's a lot of research around the role of vegetation, the role of natural vegetation versus invasive vegetation in how it influences the catchment dynamics and how floodwaters move down rivers and so on. And there's definitely evidence, of course, that degraded vegetation can increase flooding because it fails to slow the flow of floodwaters down rivers. But that's on quite a long sort of timescale. You need degraded vegetation or invasive vegetation in some cases that shifts things over longer timescales. Yeah, on shorter timescales, it's much less clear. And Lebogang actually pointed to the most important thing on the short timescales is higher antecedent rainfall, so rainfall over the past week or month that has increased the level of the water table, has increased the soil moisture saturation, and then you don't need very much extra rainfall to prompt flooding. So thanks, that was a good question, thank you.
Right. If we can go over to Amy now to hear a bit from the city's perspective. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Gina. I'm just going to share my screen and then I will start. Great. I hope everybody can see this. Please let me know if you can't. Okay, great. So I'm Amy Davison. I'm in the City of Cape Town Resilience Department. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how flood risk reduction is conceptualized in the Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan and what that means in practice. So for those of you who don't know, we have a climate change strategy that was approved by Council just about this time last year. So it's just turned 1 year old quite recently. And then we also have a climate change action plan that was approved towards the end of last year. And these two documents give quite a lot of detail about the city's approach to climate change response in terms of a number of different hazards. So I'm going to be really quick, so apologies if I talk really quickly. I just want to leave some more time for questions. But what I really wanted to emphasize was that a lot of Cape Town's flooding risk is due to high levels of vulnerability and not necessarily due to very extreme climate or weather hazards. So it doesn't take very much rain for there to be some degree of flooding in Cape Town. And there's many different types of vulnerabilities that we think about as a city. So there's physical or geographical vulnerabilities. So for example, many parts of Cape Town are situated in low-lying areas. There's a lot of water bodies. There's many areas close to the coastline, and so that obviously increases geographical vulnerability. There's social vulnerabilities where people live in housing, which is more susceptible to the impacts of severe weather. There's also sort of the legacy of historical planning decisions which were taken before we were thinking about things like climate change and before we understood some of these processes that can occur and impact people. And then also the adaptive capacity of local governments. So to what degree are we as the City of Cape Town able to respond to flood risk? So within the Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, this is under Strategic Focus Area 3, which is about water sensitivity, flood readiness, and storm management. And there's two main goals that relate to that. So the first goal is to reduce flood risk in the long term through the implementation of a water-sensitive city strategy or plan. And then the second goal is to take action in the short term to reduce flooding and storm damage through disaster mitigation approaches. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means now. So in the short, immediate term, the Winter Readiness Program is the city's main approach to reducing flood risk. It involves numerous different departments. It's led by the Disaster Risk Management Center and then is implemented through the Water and Sanitation Departments, Human Settlements, Urban Mobility, Social Development, Urban Waste Management, and a number of other departments are also involved. And this is really a cycle of winter readiness in which before the winter season occurs, there's planning and proactive implementation. During the rainy season, there's further implementation and also emergency response to winter weather. And then after the rainy season, there's a process of evaluation of the successes, the challenges that were experienced, and that then leads to sort of lessons that are learned, which reinforms winter readiness planning for the following year. So it's an ongoing cycle of planning, implementation, learning, and replanning. And then that also further informs long-term city planning around flood risk reduction. So the lessons that we learned from the winter readiness process inform long-term water-sensitive city planning and implementation. So this diagram on the left-hand side, it just shows the city's goal to move from a water supply city to a water-sensitive city, in which we take into account the whole water cycle in our approach to water supply and stormwater management. And where water moves from becoming stormwater as something that needs to be removed from the city to seeing stormwater as a resource and dealing with that in a more environmentally sensitive way. So what does this involve in practice? I'm going to speak to the winter readiness first, even though it's goal number 6, not goal number 5, because that's the sort of more shorter term approach. It involves things like communication and outreach, staff on the ground, visiting people to explain about flood risk reduction and actions that people can take to reduce flooding in their homes. It also involves some infrastructure related work, for example, cleaning out of sewers and stormwater drains through jetting to make sure that there's no blockages so that our stormwater systems can cope with floodwaters. And can also cope with, so that there's no sewer blockages, which can then contaminate floodwaters. So that occurs ahead of and during the winter season. It also involves things like inspection, repair, and maintenance of stormwater and sewer infrastructure. So making sure that ahead of the rainy season, everything is in working order, regular inspections take place to make sure that there's no breakages in the system that need to be repaired ahead of the winter season. And also the sort of somewhat less glamorous side of things, things like cleaning out canals and culverts, cleaning litter traps and litter booms and ponds to make sure that our watercourses can accept more water and that they're not clogged up by litter or other rubbish. It also looks at things like repairs and maintenance for city rental housing, where the city is responsible for that provision of housing and making sure that the weatherproofing has occurred and that there's no leaks or things that expose people to winter weather. And then finally, obviously, during a severe weather event, being able to respond quickly, having teams on the ground that are ready to respond to those kinds of impacts, whether that's clearing roads, assisting people who've been affected by floodwaters, all kinds of various different on-the-ground emergency response. Then looking ahead to the longer term planning, catchment planning for a water sensitive city, as I've already mentioned, is really about looking at stormwater differently and saying, how do we use this as a resource? How can it be treated in an environmentally sensitive way, and sort of augment our natural systems through wetlands and flares that you see here. And part of that is about creating long-term resilience through creating livable urban waterways. So that's specifically looking at waterways that occur within our urban settlements, perhaps in even quite dense suburbs, upgrading these, making them into spaces that are not just for stormwater conveyance, but also are spaces that have a recreational purpose that people want to use and therefore can assist with the maintenance thereof. And also restoring and rehabilitating wetlands so that they can continue to provide that flood attenuation function in the longer term. And finally, in doing so, also looking at innovative hybrid green and grey infrastructure approaches. So where can we mix grey infrastructure and traditional approaches with green infrastructure in a new way to create these systems that are more resilient to various different types of severe weather and climate change. And so this is just an example of a new project that's taken place in the Part of Flay area that is a really innovative approach to mixing grey and green infrastructure. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't speak too fast. Thank you.
No, fantastic, Amy. And I think for me, what's really great about that is, as somebody who works with the city, I love hearing about all the things the city does, but often for sort of citizens and other people, it's quite hard to know exactly what the response consists of. So really great to see that spread of responses, hear more about the winter readiness, and just see how it moves from sort of education to preparedness, the drain cleaning, which we know is such an important thing, but then also what's being called ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions, and how important that is to attenuate flood risk. So thanks for that, really, really great. So we've reached 11 o'clock, which is great. We've got another 30 minutes. And I was going to ask the 4 panelists to answer 2 questions, but because of the time, I'm going to say to them, could they either reflect on what they think are key sort of solutions and opportunities that need to be addressed quite urgently, or what they think are some of the big challenges that are really in the way of having more sort of sustainable and resilient flood management. So I'll ask the 4 speakers in the order that they spoke, just to sort of briefly speak. And I'm actually going to keep a timer because I really want to come to the chat and some of you who've started posting questions. So I'm going to give each of you sort of 90 seconds just to give a little response of something you think is a headline message you want to give, either on the sort of positive or some of the challenges. Cool. So first of all, and if you're able to turn on your cameras, that would be great. David, can we start with you?
Thank you, Gina. I think from my side, I'll probably want to lean on what I said earlier, that the thinking that it's only government that needed to respond, or government is the only one that needed to be active in the space of preparedness for flood. It's a fallacy and it won't hold any ground. We all collectively, from academic institutions to private sector, all the PPs, that we need to partner with each other and be able to forge ahead in terms of preparedness. Also, a lot have been done in terms of government side. We need to start deconstructing to the audience. All the messages are probably, Lebuan raised that in 11 languages are probably in English and key, but we need to deconstruct to the lower strata of our population so that they know the implication of what they're doing. Also, to add to what Chris mentioned, that we're having a lot of limited rainfalls now. which means all the wetlands that we normally see, we see them as dry lands now. We need to start protecting those lands before we see incessant invasions, because when you see it now, you might see it's dry, but when the rainfall comes around, it's under the water. So on that note, good luck to everyone, and hopefully we'll be able to take the conversation further.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Lebogang?
Thanks, Gina. From my side, I agree with what David mentioned. This has to be an integrated partnership. On our side, we always mention early warning systems is an integrated system, should be an integrated system. It cannot be done from one party. So you need that partnership between the public and private institutions, and most importantly, the communities, because they are the ones that are first affected by these disasters. And secondly, we need to increase awareness and education about these severe weather events, so that it does not become the city having to push people out of unsafe settlements, but they need to understand the risks of occupying such settlements. So we want to increase in education and awareness about hazards there. And Chris also mentioned something very important, which I did not cover in the presentation. Although there is less rainfall or a decrease in the number of days, it does not necessarily mean there will not be isolated incidents of extreme rainfall events. So similar to our current season, this winter season, we're expecting below normal rainfall, but it does not mean there will not be isolated incidents of heavy rainfall. So that's one of the key messages that's important for people to be aware, but we need to work together to try and manage the situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, opportunity or challenge. I'm not sure. But I think we all recognize there's such an opportunity here to shift governance, and that includes formal government and less non-formal government. I think there's some examples in the chat, and I know in a lot of the work Gina's done, a lot of the work I've done in Lusaka, that is a really exciting space of more participatory, collaborative learning, and participatory governance. I think it's such a key opportunity there. But I have to mention a challenge, and I think one of the key challenges is political leadership and the sort of political landscape. And I think we've seen that a lot in Cape Town, political leadership that undermines and creates these barriers and walls to actually implementing these kind of changes. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And just to say that's great, because it responds to Jason's question in the chat, where Jason's asking what has actually changed, or what needs to change to show what we've kind of said is ideal. So that's one aspect that needs to change. And maybe if I can just ask the audience to also maybe put in the chat, what do you think needs to change in order to achieve more resilience around flooding? And hopefully we'll get onto that. But first, Amy, would you like to respond?
Thanks, Gina. And so I think I'm going to talk about opportunities. I think for me, one of the greatest opportunities that we have that could really change things is green infrastructure and sort of nature-based solutions. I think it really offers us an opportunity to have more resilient systems that can better cope with sort of unpredictable weather, with flooding, and in a way that can be more cost-effective and sort of easier to implement, quicker to implement than more traditional stormwater approaches. And so to that end, we're busy right now with a project that's very generously funded through some international funders through C40, looking at developing a sort of business case for green infrastructure for flood risk reduction in Cape Town, so that we can really look at the details, look at the numbers and see, how does this all work out financially, and to make the case for that being an approach for flood risk reduction. So I think that really offers us some excellent opportunities for the future, and it's, I think, a very exciting development.
Thanks, Amy. Good, nice to hear about that. Okay, and we've got another response of solid waste management and informal settlements needing to change. And the tension there around what role does local government have when it comes to that? What role do local communities have? How do we take that forward? And I think that really talks to Alice's point, which is not just about education, but how do we actually think about governance and involving citizens. And so I see Jill has posted about a project that they've got. Jill, could I ask you just to speak for 2 minutes, and I'll time you as well, but particularly I'm interested in the bit where you talked about, let me find it, your project where you're looking at a series of best bets, and some responsibility lying with the city, of course, but other interventions requiring collaboration between the community and the city. And through your research, could you share any of those kind of short little examples of what this collaboration could look like?
Yes, sure. Thanks very much, Gina. I hope you can hear me okay. So in terms of the best bets that were formulated by the community members that we worked with in Sweet Home Farm, they came up with 6 overarching: improved construction of homes, building your house on a higher ground, maintaining the drainage system, solid waste management, raising community awareness about the hygienic disposal of wastewater and waste food, and the community working together to rebuild after a flood. So the potential interventions that they came up with kind of spoke to what needs to happen before a flood, during a flood, and after a flood happens. And just to give you a couple of quick examples, under the best bet of solid waste management, where they saw their responsibility and collaboration was community leaders working together with their ward councillor, Lungisa Somdaka, to communicate the need for better rubbish collection in their community. Also appointing rubbish monitors within every section of their community. They were very keen to be involved in making notices about the hygienic disposal of waste, waste food and wastewater. Other places where they saw their own responsibility was meeting with street committees. So the role of street committee was very strongly emphasised. Meeting with street committees to discuss who needs most new building materials after a flood has happened. Emphasising very strongly that if they are given building materials, they can rebuild their own houses. But of course, there was recently a decision to stop the provision of new building materials, which has really affected their ability to be resilient, very, very, very much affected that ability. And then just finally, they did talk about relocation and the need for certain members of the community who are living in particularly precarious parts of the settlement to be relocated, and again working with the ward councillor to identify who those people would be and to communicate that onto the higher structures. So that just gives you a few ideas about what came out of that process, Gina. And as I said, it was a participatory process. It was really driven by visual methods, including storytelling, community mapping, and photo voice. And we are hosting a policy engagement event in Philippi on the 28th of September this year, where we will talk more about these potential interventions. Community co-researchers will be present. They will also be leading the event with us, and we'd like to see as many of you there as possible. Thank you for giving me this time.
Great. Yeah, and I just think really wonderful to hear of these projects that really do sort of listen to stories. And I think for me, what's quite important is, you know, David, you talked about the enumeration, and often that tends to be more quantitative in the type of work done. But this qualitative work is just so important to understand the lived realities and what people are experiencing, and then what they see as some of the opportunities. So, you know, you talked about the street committees and the ward councillors, and that's great where they're working, but we also know in some places those don't work. So really good to hear that. And yeah, also interesting to hear about the building materials post-flood and that that's been stopped. So yeah. I just want to ask Jason, he's not able to talk at the moment, but maybe to say a little bit about the policies in the chat. So he's agreeing with the point about engaging in bold political vision, but saying that maybe some of the policies are outdated or inadequate. So Jason, if you can maybe add to the chat a little bit about that, or if anybody else has anything to add about some of the policies that they find quite frustrating, that they think could be changed, and have new visions around what that might mean going forward. And then Amy, there's also a question specifically for you around ways to encourage engineers and technicians working on stormwater ponds to implement green infrastructure methods and create more multifunctional blue-green spaces. I know we've seen quite inspiring things internationally about some of these blue-green spaces. And so do you have any sort of response to that? Is that something on the city's agenda? I know often financing of that is quite challenging, but maybe you could say a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's it's a process of change. I think we can't go from one day saying, okay, we're building traditional infrastructure, and the next day we're doing green infrastructure. And so that's why this project that I mentioned earlier is so important, because it's looking at developing the case for that, to really demonstrate to to senior management, to finance departments, to possibly external funders, why green infrastructure makes sense, excuse me, and why it would be maybe not a better way of doing things in every case, but certainly in many cases can be a better approach, can be more cost effective and quicker to implement. So I think the first step is really to demonstrate the benefits to the people who are making those decisions. And then once those benefits are clear to people, the transition will obviously be a process of change management that will take place over time. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but it's definitely a process. So it's very much a major part of our approach, and that's also where the water sensitive city comes in. Those kinds of interventions are a necessity for us to become a water sensitive city. And so, yeah, I would definitely say that that's a big part of the policy approach. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I'd like to come back to the climate change focus and bring Lebogang and Chris back in. I see Traverse has written about the concerning climate change scenarios and what we're facing, and suggests a scientific advisory panel that might be put forward nationally to quantify the risks. Lebogang, Chris, can you say a little bit more about your concerns around climate change and the impacts? Do you feel these are being taken sufficiently by city government, by private sector, by the scientific community? And is there any thing you can offer around what is being done to actually think about these risks and how they've been thought about in practice? Thanks. Chris, do you want to start in your videos on, and then Lebogang, if you could go.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for the point. I think it is really key. I think we have several generations of evidence compiled around climate change risks and impacts for South Africa. We've had long-term adaptation strategies. We've got a lot of reports, national communications, the UNFCCC. So I feel like there's a lot of evidence in place. But I think what I referred to earlier, the real challenge seems to be where does that evidence land? Does it just gather dust on a bookshelf somewhere? And how do we start to actually weave that into real policy and decision making? So a lot of the work that we're doing is sitting in that space at the moment. And I think it's challenging. It's easy for us as scientists to say, oh, Cape Town's going to get drier. It's much harder to say, what does a city, what does a province do about that? How do we manage those and trade them off, trade off climate change versus poverty reduction versus housing versus economics. So making all these different trade-offs. So I think in my mind, the way forward is, yes, we need more evidence, and there's growing evidence all the time. We need to be monitoring climate change. So I think that's something that we're struggling with increasingly in South Africa is observational networks that are monitoring what is happening, monitoring these kind of extreme events so we can understand them better. But the real key challenge is bringing all this evidence together across the disciplines and across stakeholders and decision makers to map out these pathways that are going to increase our resilience across all different types of hazards and development challenges. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And just the last part of that question was around offer policy approaches to politicians. And so I know that CSAG and ACDI are working on this climate resilient development pathways that really is grappling with how do you bring the politics and the pathways that the country is on in line with some of these climate change responses. So yeah, really important and challenging, but we need to get these diverse actors in. And it's no longer, we know that it's not just people working on climate change science or in the environment department. It really impacts on all sectors. So yes, over to you, Lebogang, please.
Thanks, Gina. I think I would say my observation is that the challenge seems to be on implementation. We just have to be honest in that in terms of advisory panels, I think we've got, in terms of legislation, when one is looking at the South African legislation and policies, they seem to be quite well. And like Chris said, the evidence is there. The challenge that I see is on the implementation of these. We have a lot of studies that have been published that have informed development of the white papers, green papers, but of course, coming back to implementation, it's a challenge. So you mentioned the issue of having advisory panels. As the South African Weather Service, we already sit in the advisory forum meetings at all government spheres, the local, district, municipal, provincial, and national disaster management advisory panels. We sit there to advise on the expected conditions. But once again, when it comes to implementation, we seem to be more reactive instead of proactive. So we want to encourage a proactive approach when we respond to disasters. So that's actually what seems to be lacking from the decision makers or those that needs to act. We need that proactive approach. Thank you.
So important. Anticipatory adaptation, putting stuff in place before the event, not waiting to see the devastation and the lives and industry and all the things that are lost from the event. How do we put in place measures before? And I know that there's a very interesting example in KZN in eThekwini of the Palmit catchment forum. And I don't know if there's anybody here who can say a little bit more about that, where there really was a collaborative, proactive approach that actually really had a positive impact and meant that the flood impacts weren't as great in that area. But it's challenging, and we need to find the will for people to engage in these proactive approaches. And we're seeing it in places, and it's very encouraging in places, but we need more of that. So thank you. And I'd like to shift now to David, who has responded to my comments and his thinking about their enumeration, which is now starting to include some qualitative data. So that's great to hear, to understand the dynamics in informal settlements. But Jason then asked, how does your approach and this inclusion inform your delivery? So David, could you say a little more for us around how you're able to integrate this qualitative data, what that means for responding, what that allows you to do, and some of the challenges? Because I know that I've worked on a project on water access, and although there's stories about the challenges around water access in low-income communities, it's quite hard for the city to sometimes find ways to integrate that data and actually respond. So David, could you say a little bit more for us, please?
Thank you, Gina, and thanks, Jason, for that question. I think the scale and magnitude of the problem is huge. The response plan from government, by the time you start delivering, the evidence has shown otherwise. I think it goes across. It's for everybody to probably imbibe that say, you know what, whatever you need to implement it as fast as possible. Any slight delay means that the evidence will show otherwise. In terms of the enumeration and qualitative data that we gather, it informs the application within the department and the response in terms of intervention. So On one hand, we need the information to inform the application, and we also need the data to inform the number of opportunities that we're creating in the space. So there's more to it. When one see informal settlement, everybody always see it in this perspective of human settlement. What happens in the space is beyond human settlement mandate. Waste necessarily is not human settlement mandate. But when somebody sees informal settlement, they think it's human settlement problem. But everything that goes around revolves around health. So that's why we say collaborative idea is the intervention to go. All departments focus their energy in a collaborative manner and transversal approach to informality. If you check our website, you see some of materials that speaks to what I'm sharing with you and what I've been talking about. And it's of great value that we all partner in this journey and be able to get somewhere. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you very much. Great, so we're reaching the end. I'd like to give each of our speakers a chance to add anything they really think is kind of one of the gaps or areas that needs to be taken forward. I think we've heard a lot about the need for collaboration, a lot about, I see somebody posted the more citizen ownership. This is a challenging one because yes, we want citizen ownership with community assets, but we also want people to have services that work. So how do we manage that tension, and what is fair to expect from different groups living in the city? So any closing remarks from the four speakers, and then maybe also from the people on the call, what are you taking away? Is there anything you think really needs to be taken forward? Because it'd be great to see that in the chat, to see what we're working with going forward around flooding and some of the areas of promise. Great. Any last points from the speakers? Amy.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, I'm just going to say firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you to all the speakers. But you know, I think there's many different ways that citizens can be involved, and it doesn't just, you know, doesn't have to be something very big that people do. Lots of small actions also add up and can really help. So one of the things that I think people really can do, and it maybe sounds a bit straightforward, but I think it's important, is when you see something, report it. If you see a blocked drain, report it. If you see a overflowing manhole or a stormwater drain that's blocked with sand or trees that have blown down, please do report it, because if you don't report it, the city doesn't know it exists, and so then we can't do anything about it. And also, I think you know, there's a lot that can be achieved through involvement in local community groups, especially where you know there are vulnerable people in your communities, elderly people, people who need assistance, to be really aware of who those people are, and sort of focus on assisting vulnerable people during severe weather events, whether that might be, you know, helping your elderly neighbor clean their stormwater, clean their gutters of leaves. Small things like that can really help add up in a community. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and it's, you know, I like the path it's taken. I mean, I think the one takeaway for me, and it's come out of a number of these kind of engagements, is it's really encouraging that the kind of interventions that we keep coming back to around shifts in governance, you know, shifts perhaps away from service provision to enabling, these kind of shifts are not specific to flooding. And if we can make some of these transitions more broad scale, you know, it impacts flooding, it impacts, you know, water resilience, it impacts poverty reduction. So these are, it's not that we're just dealing with one problem with one solution. These kind of transitions apply to a lot of different challenges. So it's a real motivation to try and figure out how to make these kind of transitions, because it would cut across so many different challenges. Thanks.
Thank you. And just to encourage people to read a lot of the posts, Alice McClure has written about the Palmeet case that I mentioned in eThekwini. And so there's some nice details there about collaboration, about early warning, and making sure that there was a plan and being able to actually action that. And so, yeah, keep a lookout for that, because there's been a lot of work put into that. And I think it is one of those examples that took a lot of time and resources, but is an example of how this collaboration might be done. So Guy also mentions WhatsApp action groups. How do we, and building on Amy's point, how do we get citizens together and make sure that people are aware? And Jill talking about the fact that often they're like physical shortage of bins, etc., nowhere to put litter, some of those things that really need to be addressed, and making sure that those are noted and that people are aware of some of the ways to request change, even if that doesn't always happen. Questions about rainwater coming off the mountain and capturing that. And yeah, I think Colleen's point about this opportunity for cross-disciplinary involvement of public health is really important. It was great to see in COVID how health was brought more into some of the sort of city thinking. And I think you're right that flooding is really a concern. You've mentioned drowning, but also some of the disease that goes with sort of stagnant water that's really important. Great. So yeah, lots more in the chat. Hard for me to read it all, but just to wrap up the session, to say thank you for an engaged audience. These future casting sessions, the next one will be on the 29th of July, exploring issues of carbon neutrality and what that means. So if you're interested in that, keep a lookout or share with your colleagues. And thanks to everybody for being on this call. It's a complex problem, but we know that it's really important. And coming back to David's point about how we ignore those living in poor conditions to our own peril. And so a lot of the impacts in the city are for those who have least resources. And so we really need to address this so that we can have a whole of city approach where people feel proud of their city and don't face the impacts of hazards as greatly as they have. So thank you all, and we will try and share the two presentations that were presented as well.